All right, sir. What are you doing here? This isn't your place.
I'm moving in. I showed you the deed already.
They're fake. He doesn't live here.
Yeah, we think so too. Coming with us. Hold up. Say that again. I'm your boss, dumbass.
When Officer David Chen saw the man standing in the hallway of Riverside Towers with a moving box and a folder of documents, he didn't hesitate. He didn't verify anything. He didn't question the caller who had reported him as suspicious. He walked straight up to Marcus Coleman and told him that someone like him couldn't possibly live in this building without proving it. When Marcus calmly showed him the deed, the official proof that he owned the apartment, Chen dismissed it entirely and warned that they were taking him to the station because, in his words, the documents looked fake. What Officer Chen didn't know was that the man he was about to arrest for trespassing in his own home was the city's newly appointed police commissioner, a position he would officially occupy the following Monday morning. And in the next 6 minutes, Marcus Coleman would be standing in a hallway holding a badge that would erase every assumption Chen had made, dismantle his career, and force a reckoning that would reach far beyond one apartment building. If you believe someone should be able to move into their own home without a cop refusing to believe their deed, like this video and subscribe. Before we go any further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. And after this story finishes, come back and tell us, what would it take for your police department to hold officers accountable the way this one did? Marcus Coleman arrived at Riverside Towers at 8:30 on a Wednesday morning in late September with a moving truck parked at the curb and a schedule that gave him 3 hours before his first department meeting. He was 49 years old. He had spent 24 years moving through the ranks of the city's police department, patrol officer to detective to captain to commander, always reaching for the next level, always proving he belonged in spaces that hadn't been built for him. 3 weeks ago, the mayor had appointed him police commissioner. Monday morning, he would officially occupy the office. Today was moving day into the apartment he had purchased 6 weeks earlier. Apartment 4E at Riverside Towers. The deed was signed. The inspection had passed. The title was in his name. He had handled the paperwork himself, careful and methodical, the way he handled everything. The boxes were straightforward. Books, 2 sealed boxes of them, his collection from academy training and decades of reading case files and procedural manuals. Kitchen items wrapped in newspaper. A framed photograph of his parents from 1987. Personal belongings that defined a living space but didn't require help from anyone else. He moved deliberately. 24 years had taught him that rushing created mistakes. Patience created completion. The 4th floor hallway was quiet when he made his first trip. Morning light fell through a corridor window, casting rectangles across carpet that muffled his footsteps. He carried the first box toward 4E. Then the second. On his 4th trip, he noticed a woman standing near the elevator. Late 50s. Arms crossed. Posture that suggested she had appointed herself guardian of something. Her name was Kiara Morrison. She had lived in apartment 4D for 16 years. She had watched the building change, and she had made it her work to resist that change. She was the kind of resident who knew the unofficial rules, who belonged, who didn't, what disrupted the order she had maintained. Marcus nodded at her as he passed. The automatic gesture. The one that usually diffused situations before they escalated. She said nothing. On his 6th trip, she stepped directly in front of him. "Excuse me," she said. Her tone was sharp, edged with the certainty of someone who considered confrontation her responsibility. "What are you doing in this building?" Marcus set the box down against the wall carefully. His movements were controlled. He had learned what it meant to move quickly around people who were already afraid. He had learned what it meant to have your body read as a threat. 24 years had taught him that calmness was a tool. "I'm moving in," he said. His voice was level. Empty of anything that could be misread. "I purchased apartment 4E 3 weeks ago." Kiara's eyes moved from his face to the box to the apartment door he had been opening and closing. Her expression didn't change. It was the expression of someone who had already decided what was true and would only gather evidence that confirmed it. "I've lived here for 16 years, she said. "I know who belongs in this building and who doesn't. I've never seen you before. And I haven't been informed of any new resident." The words were measured. But underneath them was the thing she wasn't hiding, that his presence violated something, that his existence in this hallway was evidence of something being wrong. Marcus kept his voice steady. "I'm the owner," he said. "The transaction closed 6 weeks ago. I have the deed." "I don't believe that," Kiara said flatly. "And even if it's real, I can tell when something doesn't belong here. You don't fit this building." Marcus turned without responding and opened his apartment door. He stepped inside. Kiara heard him moving, a drawer opening, papers being shifted. He returned 30 seconds later with a folder. From it, he withdrew his deed, his proof of purchase, his ownership documentation. Everything official. Everything legitimate. He held it toward her. Kiara glanced at the papers without taking them. "Those are fake," she said. The logic was already circular. The deed bore the county seal. His name was on it. The unit number was correct. The purchase date was documented. But none of that mattered. She had already decided. "They're legitimate," Marcus said. His voice remained level. "They're from the county recorder's office. You can verify them right now. Just call the building management company. The number is on the deed. They'll confirm everything in a minute." Kiara shook her head. "I'm not calling anyone. I'm calling the police. Something about this isn't right. You don't look like you belong here. A man moving boxes into this building at 8 in the morning without anyone informing me, that's suspicious." She pulled out her phone. Marcus set the folder against the wall. He said nothing else. More words wouldn't matter. Proof didn't convince someone who had already made a decision. He turned and walked back down the hallway toward the elevator, toward the truck, toward the remaining boxes. Behind him, he heard Kiara's voice as the dispatcher answered. "Yes, I'd like to report someone suspicious in my building. There's a man carrying boxes, and I don't know who he is. No, he doesn't live here. He says he purchased an apartment, but I don't believe him. I think he might be committing fraud or trespassing. Please send officers right away." 9 minutes after Kiara hung up, the elevator opened on the 4th floor and 2 uniformed officers stepped into the hallway. Officer David Chen came first, mid-40s, 15 years on the force, the kind of officer who had learned early that efficiency meant accepting the caller's framing without questioning it. Officer Sarah Williams followed, younger by 8 years, 3 years on the force, still in the stage where she followed Chen's certainty rather than developing her own judgment. Kiara was waiting near the elevator. She pointed immediately toward Marcus, who was standing outside his apartment door with another box in his hands. "That's him," she said. "That's the suspicious person. I've never seen him before. He won't identify himself properly." Officer Chen walked toward Marcus. Officer Williams was slightly behind. "All right, sir. What are you doing here?" Chen asked. His tone carried assumption of guilt presented as routine inquiry. "This isn't your place." Marcus set the box down. "I'm moving in," he said. "I purchased apartment 4E 6 weeks ago. I have documentation." "We got a call about a suspicious individual," Chen said. His hand rested near his duty belt. "We need to verify that you actually live here." "I have more than verification," Marcus said. He opened his apartment door and retrieved the folder. He withdrew his driver's license, his deed, his proof of purchase, his title transfer. Everything official. Everything documented. Everything legitimate. Officer Chen took the papers. He reviewed them slowly. His partner looked over his shoulder. The deed was clear. The name matched the ID. The transaction was documented. The unit number was correct. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, wrong with any of it. But then Kiara's voice came from down the hallway, still insistent. "Those are fake," she called out. "I'm telling you, documents can be forged. You need to check with the county. You need to verify this." Officer Chen paused. Something shifted in his expression. Not confusion. Permission. The permission to doubt what he was holding in his hands. If the caller insisted something was wrong, then something probably was. If a woman who had lived here for 16 years didn't recognize this man, then his caution was justified. He looked at Marcus. "She raises a fair point," he said. His voice had hardened. "These could be fraudulent documents. We're going to need to verify everything at the station. Call the building management company," Marcus said. His voice remained level, but something in it had shifted. He was no longer making a suggestion. He was setting a boundary. "The number is on the deed. They have a record of this purchase. They can verify everything right now." Officer Chen shook his head. "If this deed is fake, why would we call a number printed on it? That doesn't make sense. We need to verify this through proper channels." "I showed you legal documentation," Marcus said quietly. "I offered you a way to verify it immediately. I'm standing outside my apartment moving my belongings. That's not illegal." Officer Williams shifted her weight. Her eyes moved between Chen and Marcus. Something in her expression suggested discomfort, uncertainty, maybe. Something she wasn't prepared to voice in front of her senior officer. "Yeah, we think so, too," Chen said, his tone shifting to something harder, more certain. "You're coming with us. Turn around. Hands where I can see them." Marcus raised his hands slowly. Deliberately. Making sure both officers could see every movement. "I'm complying," he said. "But I want to be clear, I've shown you my deed. I've offered you verification. You're detaining me anyway." As Chen stepped closer and Williams began to move around him, doors opened along the hallway. A neighbor peeked out from 4D, saw the officers, and quickly closed the door again. Someone on a balcony above was recording with a phone. Kiara stood near the elevator with her arms crossed, flushed with the satisfaction of having mobilized authority, of having corrected the situation. This was the moment. This was when a man standing outside his own home with legal proof of ownership would be treated like a criminal. Would be detained like a suspect. Would be removed from his own apartment by officers who chose to believe an accusation over evidence. Marcus was about to be handcuffed outside his own door when he paused. He had one thing that might change what was about to happen. One thing in his back pocket that might stop these officers from completing the arrest they had already decided to make. He reached slowly. Both officers tensed immediately, ready for what they expected, a weapon, or another false document, or some reason to justify the arrest they were making. He withdrew his badge wallet. Inside was his identification. Inside was the shield of the city's police department. And stamped below his name were the words, "Police Commissioner." The hallway went completely silent. Officer Chen's face drained of color. Not gradually. In a single moment. The way a face goes white when someone realizes they've made a mistake they can't take back. Officer Williams took a small step backward without seeming to realize she'd done it. Both of them knew what this meant. They had received internal memos 3 weeks ago. They had seen the name. They had seen the photograph. They had been standing in the hallway, about to arrest the city's new police commissioner, a man who would have authority over their careers, their certifications, their futures. Kiara's voice came from down the hallway, still defiant but now cracking. That badge could be fake. Officer Chen cut her off with a sharp hand movement. His eyes never left Marcus's badge. Marcus closed the badge wallet and put it back in his pocket. He looked at both officers with an expression that was completely composed and absolutely final. The expression of a man who had just watched two careers pivot toward destruction. "Hold up," he said quietly. His voice was steady, measured. "Say that again." "I'm your boss, dumbass." He let the words sit in the hallway. He let them understand what they had just done. What they had just attempted. What was about to happen because they had chosen to believe a resident's accusation over legal documentation and their own eyes. "I will expect both of you in my office Monday morning at 8 a.m., Marcus said. His voice carried no anger. Anger would have been easier to handle. This was worse. This was procedural. "Come prepared to explain your decision-making process in this hallway and your response to presented documentation." Neither officer said anything. Marcus turned to Kiara. "You will be hearing from my attorney," he said simply. Then he looked back at the two officers. "Before either of you leaves this building, I need 3 things. The CCTV footage from this hallway covering the entire incident from when I arrived. The 911 audio recording your dispatcher received. An official written documentation, your badge numbers, the call log, dispatch times, and a detailed account of everything that occurred in this hallway. I need it before you leave the building." Officer Chen nodded once. The nod of a man standing in wreckage. He pulled out his notebook. Officer Williams did the same, her movements now smaller, more careful, understanding that every detail would be reviewed and documented against her. Marcus picked up his box from the hallway floor. He carried it into apartment 4E and closed the door behind him. He had a move to finish. The work continued in silence. By early afternoon, the truck was empty. By evening, Marcus was sitting on his apartment floor surrounded by unopened boxes, the folder of ownership documents on the kitchen counter, and 3 specific items on his phone, the CCTV footage, the 911 recording, and the incident report. He listened to the 911 call once that evening. Kiara's voice came through clearly, describing a suspicious man, a man who didn't belong, a man carrying boxes without authorization. He watched the hallway footage once, the moment he showed the officers his deed, the moment they refused to call for verification, the moment they stepped toward him to make the arrest. Then he set his phone down, made himself dinner, and went to bed. The next morning, he reviewed the dispatch logs more carefully. A name appeared in the notes that Marcus recognized. Officer David Chen. And the name appeared in another file on his computer, a complaint file from 2017. A black resident who had been detained without cause. A case that had been closed without meaningful investigation. The incident in the hallway wasn't random. It was a pattern. And on Monday morning, when Marcus walked into police headquarters as the city's new police commissioner, he was walking in with the knowledge of exactly what needed to change. And he had the documentation to prove it. Monday morning arrived with the precision Marcus had built his career around. He entered police headquarters at 7:15 a.m., 30 minutes before the officers were scheduled to arrive, his uniform immaculate, his badge reflecting the fluorescent hallway lighting. The administrative staff who recognized him from the internal memos greeted him with the careful politeness of people unsure whether to acknowledge what had happened on Saturday. Marcus moved past the greeting with a nod and walked into his office for the first time as police commissioner. The incident file was already on his desk. Someone had prepared it, the CCTV footage, the 911 recording, the incident report with Officer Chen's signature and badge number listed. Marcus didn't process these as evidence of a personal insult. He processed them as he processed everything else, as data points in a larger case. As a detective processes a crime scene. As a commander processes patterns. He reviewed the 911 call first. Kiara's voice came through the speakers, describing a suspicious man with boxes, a man who didn't belong, a man acting in ways that warranted police intervention. Then he reviewed the hallway footage. The officers arriving. The dismissal of his deed. The moment Chen refused to call the building management company. The officer stepping toward him with the posture of men about to make an arrest. Marcus made a note in the file. Then he opened his computer and drafted a memo to Internal Affairs. The memo was precise. It outlined 3 points: the officer's refusal to verify documentation using the direct method provided by a resident claiming ownership, the attempted detention without probable cause based on unsupported allegations rather than evidence, and the reliance on a civilian's claims without independent verification. Marcus requested a formal investigation into Officer David Chen's decision-making and Officer Sarah Williams's participation in the detention. He also requested a review of their personnel files and any prior complaints with similar patterns. At 8 a.m., Officer Chen and Officer Williams sat across from Marcus's desk. Neither spoke. Neither made excuses. Both understood that they were sitting in front of a man who had documentation and authority and no obligation to listen to their explanations before decisions were made. Marcus let the silence sit for 30 seconds before he spoke. "I've opened a formal investigation into Saturday's incident," he said. His voice was level, procedural. "That investigation will examine your decision-making process, your response to presented documentation, and your justification for escalation. Internal Affairs will contact both of you with next steps. This meeting is concluded." He turned his chair slightly, a gesture that made clear the conversation was finished. Both officers left without speaking. By Tuesday evening, Internal Affairs had pulled Officer David Chen's personnel file. The document was thick, 20 pages of incident reports, complaint summaries, and closed investigations. Marcus reviewed each one. A 2019 complaint from a black resident detained during a welfare check who had presented identification that Chen dismissed as potentially fraudulent. A 2020 complaint from a Latina woman accused of loitering who had explained she was waiting for her ride and Chen had escalated her to a stop and frisk based on her demeanor. A 2022 complaint from an Asian resident who had been questioned about a vehicle parked in his own driveway, with Chen refusing to accept the registration as proof of ownership until backup arrived and verification was complete. All 3 complaints had been closed as unfounded with minimal inquiry. The summary notes on one read, "Officer Chen exercised appropriate caution in a situation where the complainant's behavior was ambiguous. The behavior in question had been existing in public while not matching the neighborhood's perceived demographic profile." Officer Sarah Williams's file was thinner but followed a similar trajectory. 7 complaints in 3 years. 6 of them involving minorities. 3 described situations that mirrored the hallway incident almost exactly: documentation presented, dismissed, escalation recommended based on a white civilian's corroborating claim. Marcus sent a second memo to Internal Affairs. He requested an expanded review of both officers' stop data for the previous 5 years, focusing specifically on detentions initiated based on suspicious person calls, the racial demographics of those detained, and the outcomes of those stops. He requested a cross-reference of every call where the officers had cited documentation concerns as justification for escalation. The data came back within 48 hours. Over 5 years, Officer Chen had initiated 17 stops based on suspicious person calls. 15 of those stops involved people of color. Of those 15, 11 ended in detention or citation, and in 9 of those cases, the person involved had presented documentation that Chen had classified as potentially fraudulent without verification. Of the 9, 0 were actually fraudulent. Officer Williams had initiated 12 stops over 3 years. 10 involved people of color. 7 escalated based on documentation concerns. All 7 were legitimate. On Wednesday, Marcus requested that Internal Affairs pull security footage from Riverside Towers for the entire year prior to Saturday's incident. The building's management company complied without hesitation, understanding that cooperation was more prudent than obstruction. The footage review took 2 investigators 8 hours. What they found was a pattern that extended far beyond Saturday morning. Kiara Morrison appeared in the common areas at times unrelated to her own movement through the building. Hallway recordings from June showed her standing near the elevator for 40 minutes, watching a black couple moving boxes into apartment 3F. July footage showed her near the building entrance when a Latings family arrived with moving trucks, her phone in her hand, her eyes tracking their movement. August footage showed her in the 4th floor hallway, standing outside an apartment door, watching a black resident attempt to key into his apartment, her hand moving toward her phone immediately after he entered. The building's management records revealed what the footage confirmed. Kiara had filed 37 complaints over 16 years. 28 of those complaints were filed against black residents. The complaints ranged from noise violations that neighbors in adjacent units corroborated as normal apartment sounds, to claims of unknown visitors without verification of who actually lived in the targeted apartments, to allegations of loitering in common areas that the building's own security footage contradicted. Of 37 complaints, 4 had resulted in any action by building management. Of those 4, none had resulted in tenant removal or meaningful consequence. 3 black residents had moved out within 6 months of sustained complaint campaigns by Kiara. 2 of them had left reviews on apartment listing sites mentioning a hostile resident who made them feel unsafe in their own space. Internal Affairs contacted the 3 residents who had moved out. 2 agreed to speak. The first was a black woman who had lived in apartment 4C for 8 months before the harassment made staying impossible. She described Kiara knocking on her door to complain about noise while she was watching television at normal volume. Kiara calling building management to report her repeatedly. Kiara standing in the hallway staring at her door on multiple occasions. She had filed 2 complaints with building management that were resolved with nothing more than a letter to Kiara asking her to be more considerate. She had left because the environment became unbearable. The second resident was a black man who had lived in apartment 3E for 4 months before Kiara's complaint campaign made his daily life impossible. He described Kiara waiting in the hallway for him to arrive, described her making comments about his visitors, described being reported to police for being in his own apartment during daytime hours. He had not filed complaints because he didn't believe anything would change. Both of them, upon hearing the details of what had happened to Marcus on Saturday, said the same thing in different words, though they were not surprised. On Thursday morning, Marcus received a memo from Internal Affairs that shifted the investigation into a new direction. The dispatch notes for Saturday's 911 call had been reviewed not just for content but for edit history. The department's digital system logged all annotations and modifications to call records, tracking which staff member made changes and when. The initial 911 call, as recorded by the dispatcher, had been relatively straightforward. Kiara reporting a suspicious person in the building, describing boxes, describing her concern about his legitimacy. The call notes, as logged initially, reflected that language. But someone had appended additional annotations to the call record approximately 2 hours after the initial call was completed. The additions included details not present in the original audio, references to possible fraud, escalated threat assessment language, and specific instructions flagging the situation as a possible identity theft scheme requiring immediate officer response with caution. The edit trail pointed to a specific department employee. A staff dispatcher with access to call log annotations. A person whose name appeared in a separate file, an administrative matter from 3 years prior, a disciplinary note that had never resulted in formal action. The discovery created a new question. The officer's response had been aggressive, but that aggression had been justified by call notes that didn't match the original 911 audio. Someone inside the department had altered the record to make Kiara's call sound more serious than she had actually described it. Marcus reviewed the dispatcher's personnel file. The employee's name appeared in internal communication chains related to concerns about Marcus's appointment. The chain suggested a faction within the department that viewed his selection as threatening, a threat to existing practices, to officers who relied on discretionary enforcement, to a way of operating that depended on minimal oversight. By Friday, Internal Affairs had traced the communication chains further. The dispatcher who had modified the call log was part of an informal group within the department. 7 officers and 4 administrative staff, most of them with histories of their own complaints, or protections of officers with patterns. Most of them concentrated in divisions that had resisted prior reform efforts. The building location was also not random. Riverside Towers sat in a district where a controversial incident had occurred 7 years prior. A case that Marcus, then a commander in another division, had refused to bury. An investigation he had pushed forward despite pressure to close it quietly. Officers involved in that case had faced discipline. That discipline had ended careers. Those ended careers had created resentment. The humiliation in the hallway on Saturday wasn't random racism alone. It was a calculated attempt to create a story. A new police commissioner, on his first day in office, caught in a scandal. A narrative that could be controlled, fed to media, used to undermine his legitimacy before he officially took power. A scenario designed to provoke an emotional response, to make him look like he was using his position for personal revenge. But Marcus hadn't responded emotionally. He had responded methodically. He had requested evidence. He had documented the incident. He had reviewed the files. He had allowed the investigation to unfold rather than acting from anger. That restraint meant the investigation revealed not just what had happened in the hallway, but what had happened before it. Who had known it was coming? Who had prepared the ground for it? Marcus received confirmation that the altered dispatch note had triggered the officer's probable cause narrative. That altered note had been the justification they offered themselves for escalation. The note had been created by someone inside the department specifically to ensure officer response was aggressive enough to create a scene. The case was no longer about neighbor racism and officer bias. It was about an internal attempt to compromise the incoming commissioner through public humiliation, and an internal network that had protected corruption for years through minimized oversight and altered records. The unseen twist had surfaced. And now it needed to be dismantled. By Monday of the following week, Internal Affairs had completed its preliminary findings. Officer David Chen and Officer Sarah Williams were both suspended pending termination recommendations based on pattern evidence spanning 5 years, failure to verify documented proof of residency, unlawful escalation without probable cause, and reliance on unverified allegations rather than presented evidence. The evidence was comprehensive. The patterns were undeniable. The video documentation was explicit. The union representative who reviewed the case understood that this was not a situation where defense was possible. The hallway footage existed. The 911 audio existed. The edited call log existed. The 5 years of stop data existed. The pattern of documentation dismissal existed. No legal argument could dissolve evidence this direct. The union declined to pursue appeals before the officers even requested them. On the same day the suspension notices were issued, Marcus met with the department's policy committee. He came with 3 specific reform proposals. The first required all officers to document their specific reason for doubting identification or ownership documentation rather than simply classifying items as potentially fraudulent. The second created an independent civilian review panel for all discrimination complaints, removing the internal process that had allowed patterns to persist unchecked. The third established clear response protocols for suspicious person calls that required verification of actual criminal activity before escalation. All 3 proposals were adopted within 72 hours. Marcus filed a civil lawsuit against Kiara Morrison on Wednesday. The suit cited discrimination, harassment, and filing a false police report motivated by racial bias. It sought $200,000 in damages. The 911 recording became the centerpiece of the case not because it was unique, but because it was undeniable. Kiara's voice stated her exact motivation without ambiguity. The presence of a black man in her building made her uncomfortable enough to call police. That motivation, recorded, made every other element of her complaint history context rather than coincidence. Building management was pulled into the legal pressure simultaneously. The civil suit named the building's management company as negligent in its failure to address repeated discriminatory complaints over 16 years, and negligent in its failure to protect tenants from sustained harassment campaigns. The management company understood that settling was more economical than defending against evidence that showed they had received complaints, had done minimal investigation, and had allowed patterns to continue unchecked. Kiara attempted to reframe her actions through her attorney as concern for building safety. The framing lasted until the 911 recording was made public. Until residents and media heard her voice stating that a black man didn't belong in the building. Until her own complaint history was released, showing 28 complaints against black residents and minimal substantiated findings. Until the building security footage was reviewed by courts and media, showing her deliberate surveillance of specific residents. The reframing collapsed. What she had intended as a safety call became documented racial discrimination. What she had believed was her right became a record of sustained harassment. By Thursday, investigators had traced the dispatch edit history to its source. The dispatcher who had modified the call log was formally interviewed. The interview revealed coordination. Information shared among the informal network about Marcus's appointment. Discussions about how to handle the transition. A decision to create a situation that would complicate his leadership before it began. The dispatcher was disciplined and referred for further investigation. But the investigation extended beyond the dispatcher. It extended to the network of officers and staff who had shared information, who had protected certain officers from discipline, who had benefited from the practices Marcus's appointment threatened. 3 additional officers were investigated for prior conduct that previous internal affairs inquiries had closed without adequate scrutiny. 2 cases involving wrongful detention were reopened. 1 case involving evidence tampering in a minor drug charge was re-evaluated. The reveal landed with weight in the department's internal communication systems. Not as news of external failure, but as documentation of internal corruption. The humiliation Marcus had faced in the hallway had been orchestrated from within his own institution. The scenario designed to undermine him was created by people he would oversee. His restraint, his refusal to respond emotionally, his decision to document and investigate rather than react, had become the mechanism by which the corruption was exposed. On Friday afternoon, Marcus held a press conference. He spoke for 6 minutes without notes. He described Saturday morning. He described carrying boxes. He described showing officers his deed. He described watching them refuse to verify it. He described the badge moment in clinical terms, not as a revelation, but as a moment when documentation finally mattered because institutional hierarchy finally made it matter. Then he said the lines that would be quoted repeatedly over the following weeks: I had documentation, patience, and institutional power, and I still faced escalation. Most people don't have all 3. Most people don't have any of them. And they encounter the same thing every day in buildings like this one. He didn't frame the incident as his own injustice. He framed it as proof of a system that required power to validate legitimacy. He framed it as evidence of what happened to people without badges, without institutional position, without the resources to document and fight back. The city's response intensified after that conference. Media outlets began investigating Riverside Towers. They contacted former tenants. They reviewed Kiara's complaint history. They examined building management's response protocols. The building became a symbol of housing discrimination and the weaponization of emergency systems against residents. By the end of the month, Officer David Chen and Officer Sarah Williams were officially terminated. The termination letters cited their pattern complaints, their 5-year history of dismissing documentation from people of color, their failure to verify information before escalation, and the specific incident in which they attempted to arrest the incoming police commissioner. The dispatch edit staffer was suspended pending a departmental hearing. Additional cases were reopened. A review of dispatch annotations across 2 years of calls identified another 97 cases where call notes had been modified to justify more aggressive responses. Most of those modifications involving calls where the dispatcher had a documented connection to the responding officers. Kiara lost her job after the 911 recording circulated through her employer's network. The recording made clear that her discrimination wasn't incidental, it was her reason for calling. Her employer terminated her within days, citing conduct incompatible with company values and the reputational damage her actions had caused. The building management company settled with the 3 former tenants who had moved out due to harassment, and implemented mandatory procedures for documenting complaints, mandatory escalation reviews when complaints exceeded 3 in any 12-month period from a single resident, and mandatory independent review of all tenant harassment allegations. Kiara received the lease termination notice 6 weeks after the trial verdict. She had 90 days to vacate apartment 4D, the apartment she had lived in for 16 years and spent 16 years defending against change. On a Tuesday morning in November, she moved out. Building security footage captured her carrying boxes to a moving truck. The same hallway where she had confronted Marcus with accusations about his legitimacy. The same elevator where she had watched residents she deemed suspicious. The same building she had spent 2 decades trying to preserve as exclusively as possible. She was gone before noon. Marcus sat in his office as the city's police commissioner, moving through his apartment in the evenings, unpacking boxes carefully, the hallway now quiet, the camera still recording, but the power dynamic fundamentally changed. The true win wasn't personal. It was the policy shifts. The reopened cases. The altered dispatch records now subject to audit. The public record that made the old pattern harder to hide. The man treated as if he didn't belong had forced the system to prove it deserved to be trusted.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it. And let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.